There you go.
Good afternoon, everybody. How lovely to see you. Hi, Libby.
Hi, Stacey. Hello, Peter.
Hi.
And welcome to Tracy Baker. Great that you could join us this afternoon. Peter, how do you do?
Good, good. Let's do this share screen bit so the worry is behind me.
Yes, sure. Let me just set that up for you. Give me 1 second. Okay, who can share? All participants. Great, you should be able to now share, Pete.
Yep. Okay.
How's
so
that?
Are you seeing my screen?
We are seeing the screen. Potts Point, Elizabeth Bay.
Yes.
Hallelujah.
Now we can see Tracy too. Hi there.
Hello.
Hi.
I'll just ask everyone to mute yourselves while Pete and I are sort of chatting through the interview, and then at the end we'll open it up for some questions. Welcome to Rhonda, who's just joined us. Thank you, Rhonda, for being here this afternoon. And Pete, we might just give it another minute or two because we're just sitting on 2:58. We'll just give it till 3 o'clock for a few people to join, and then we shall get started. I think I might just have enough time to grab a glass of water. How's everyone been doing this afternoon? Have you been out getting some sunshine?
Yeah, I did this morning, and then this afternoon kind of, I don't know, you tend to get a bit lazy.
I sat in the sun for half an hour. It was really nice.
It was beautiful. We all need that vitamin D.
Yeah, I think it's really good for our mental health too right now, isn't it? Just that vitamin D, you know, just seeing the sun makes you feel a little bit more optimistic and hopeful.
Sure does. Particularly when you avoid 11 o'clock for the numbers. Just don't listen to 11 o'clock anymore.
Yeah, right.
It's too depressing.
I rang someone last week to talk real estate, and this lady said, "Oh, don't call me at 5 minutes to 11. I've got to go and watch Gladys."
Oh, God.
She hung up the phone and ran away.
Really?
Yeah.
No.
Who needs reality TV, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Damn.
All right, we're just sitting on 3:01. So I think we might kick things off. I'm just going to mute you, Trace, while we're chatting. Well, firstly, let me start by introducing Dr. Peter Sheridan AM to our group this afternoon. Peter is an internationally recognised historian, collector and speaker on Art Deco design. He also collects radios, and I've seen some of your beautiful radios on your website, Peter, from the 30s and 40s. And he's an accredited professional photographer. Peter is a committee member of the Art Deco and Modernism Society of Australia and has lectured on design at the Art Deco World Congress and the College of Fine Arts, New South Wales. Now, I stumbled across Peter because he's just released a new book which I saw pop up on social media, and we're going to talk about that today. But Peter really here is today to tell us a little bit more about Art Deco design and why it's so prolific in this 2011 postcode. We'll also talk about the joys of Art Deco living. And the backdrop to today's conversation is the sale of apartment 29 in the famed the Wroxton building, 20 to 22 Roslyn Gardens, which I am proudly representing at Richardson and Wrench Double Bay. So Peter, look, I'm really going to hand the microphone over to you, but I will just start by saying that to some people, Art Deco architecture can be a little bit offbeat. And then to others, it's a statement of interesting design, it's full of character, and incredible detail from the period. So why don't you just tell us a little bit more about why you love Art Deco and how you got to be such an expert on the subject?
Oh, by accident, really, as most things are. I started collecting Art Deco in the late 80s, early 90s. Previous to that, I'd collected Victorian furniture and I'd lived in a Federation house. But I'd seen some wonderful Art Deco pieces in New York, and they'd always interested me. And then I bought a couple of radios in London, and one was an Australian radio from the 1930s, and another was an American radio. And what fascinated me was that there was this cross-fertilization that was happening around that time. And it turned out quite interesting that Art Deco was the first global design movement. It was the first movement that actually not only penetrated almost all countries, but then penetrated almost every part of the community in terms of style, both for fashion, jewelry, transport, furniture, industrial items, and so forth. And it was a huge change in the way people looked at consumerism. And so this effect globally was very interesting to me, that Australia, being at the time very British, was able to incorporate what was basically a European and American style into a very, very British community here. And so while it was never the flavor of, it was never the total flavor, there was a lot of Art Deco penetrated into Australia, both through architecture and through many other cultural and lifestyle elements. And one of the things particularly that fascinated me was art, and the women artists that were so prolific in the 30s, like Margaret Preston, Grace Cossington Smith, Dorrit Black, all of those ladies were painting in what's called the Art Moderne style or modern style, but it's actually Art Deco. And one of the few issues that we have is that Art Deco was only coined the term in the 1960s. And so in many areas like architecture and art, it is not a term that's used all the time. And that unfortunately means that it doesn't have the eminence and the prestige that it should have, because in those areas, it's called something else. And I think it's time that we actually called these things for what they are. And most of the things that, like the Wroxton, are purely Art Deco architecture. They're not just interwar, which the architects would have you call them. They are actually beautiful pieces of Art Deco.
Peter, are there certain architects that are responsible for kicking this whole period off, and who might they be?
In the Art Deco world, it was Emil Soderstone in Australia, Bruce Dellett in Australia. Dudley Ward, who did the Wroxton, was also quite an eminent architect and very early. The Wroxton is an interesting early streamlined functional building. And so and luckily we have in the area 5 by Emil Soderstone, and Bruce Dellett's Minerva or Metro Theatre. So it's not just a matter of quantity that we have a lot of Art Deco. We have some very good Art Deco as well.
Can we just talk for a moment, Peter, about some of the key design elements that make Art Deco what it is? Because we can see in some of those photos that you've got up on the screen there at the moment, there's a lot of sharp angles. But then when you look at, say, the foyer of the Wroxton building, there's these beautiful curved shapes. And particularly when you go into apartment 29, there's curved hallway there. So it seems a bit of a juxtaposition.
Well, it was a rejection of classicism and a rejection of Art Nouveau with its organic flowing lines, became much more angular, geometric. And so many of the motifs of Art Deco are chevrons, parallel lines, all sorts of different sunbursts and so forth. And so you get this angularity that appears not only as an addition, as a decoration, but actually as part of the building itself. And that's where Wroxton's really nice, because the angularity in the balconies at the front are actually built into the building fabric itself. So Art Deco was not just an additional decorative idea. It actually was integral to the style itself.
Would you like to walk us through some of these slides that you have here, Peter?
Sure. Look, for those of you who might be considering living in this area, I don't think anybody could do any better than live here. I've lived in the southwest of Sydney, upper and lower North Shore, Bondi. I moved here some 20 years ago, really by accident. We just were looking in other places and couldn't find an apartment that suited us. And we finally found something here. It wasn't Art Deco because I couldn't get one with parking that was appropriate or that was big enough. So we decodified our apartment, but I couldn't imagine living anywhere else now. This is a small enclave of about 1 square kilometre with 17,000 inhabitants, of which about 98% live in apartments. That's not my dog, that's somebody else's dog.
No, it's my dog.
It's okay. Mine's somewhere around, but we'll find, she'll come in at some stage. That is one feature of this area which is extraordinary, is 98% of people live here in apartments, where as the rest of Sydney and Australia, you can get really up to 90% of people living in houses. And it's been the densest living area in Australia for nearly 100 years, although there are other places now with huge high-rise which are starting to bypass it. In the late 1800s, it was a suburb of grand villas. In the 1920s to 40s, a space for people who worked in the city. In the 50s, a centre for bohemians, artists and actors. In the 70s to the 90s, it was an offshoot of King's Cross with its nightlife, drugs and organised crime. But today, as the Cross sort of disappears, Potts Point and Elizabeth Bay have become extraordinarily desirable places to live. And it's not just unique because of its proximity to the harbour, shops, restaurants and King's Cross, but that it contains this extraordinary cluster of Art Deco and modernist apartment blocks and very little high-rise. And I think that we should see this in an international status, sort of comparable to Napier in New Zealand and Miami South Beach in Florida. It also has the widest range of inhabitants in Sydney. It has a cross-section of wealthy, elderly downsizers, gay and lesbians of all ages, backpackers, Airbnbs, although there's not many of those at the moment, young couples with babies, and every variety of dog. And people now call it Paws Point. So that's the background to where we live at the moment. And for those who might want to live here, as I say, I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. If you look at the profile of the area and from the water, you get a good idea of this. It's not been blighted by modern high-rise. Most of the buildings are under 12 stories tall. And if you look at the 1938 profile, it's not that much different from today. What we've got here is about 75 Art Deco buildings from the 30s and 40s and another 30 modernist buildings from the 60s. We've got 9 colonial mansions from the 19th century. And as I said before, it's not just about quantity. We've got some wonderful highlights from Soderston and Seidler. And in the colonial mansions, we have Elizabeth Bay House, which was considered the finest house in the colony at the time. There are two major hubs of Art Deco in Sydney, the CBD, and then Potts Point, Elizabeth Bay, some 2 kilometres east of the city. And these contain the major concentrations of Art Deco, although if you flow out through New South Head Road and Oxford Street out to the eastern suburbs, you'll see quite a lot of Art Deco as it's spread out through the suburbs. There's some on the North Shore as well, lower North Shore, up to places like Manly and Seaforth, Balgowlah. There's quite a lot of Art Deco there as well. You can see here, I think the little arrow will show you Wroxton on the left there at the edge of Elizabeth Bay. This is a map of the area, and this is the outline of Potts Point and Elizabeth Bay, and with Macleay Street basically running north-south, separating the two suburbs. Wroxton is across here on the edge of Rushcutters Bay in Elizabeth Bay. The Macleay Street is the spine of the area. It's full of restaurants, coffee shops, patisseries, small boutiques and shops. And here we're looking south towards the cross. On our left, we have Elizabeth Bay dropping down, and then on our right, we have to the west, we have Potts Point, which is really one long block between Macleay and Victoria Streets, and then drops down into Woolloomooloo. If you look at the 1940s, Macleay Street in Potts Point was actually considered one of the premier streets in Sydney. And this black and white photo on the right, on this photo here, shows the prominence of Art Deco apartment blocks with the Macleay Regis at the bottom, and then going upwards, you've got the Selsdon, 20 Macleay Street, Kings Clear, which is not Art Deco, and Kingsley Hall a little further up. So this was not just another street in Sydney. People regarded this as one of the premier places to live. And the Macleay Regis was a large apartment block with lifts, company title, which appealed to people who wanted to buy their own apartments. You have to understand that almost all people, other than those who bought into company title apartment blocks, rented. And strata title didn't come in till the 60s. And many of these buildings were owned by individuals and rented out until they were strated after the 60s. Those that were company title, there's about 15 of them left in the area, still retain that way of ownership. Now, okay, let's do something. Not doing anything. Okay, so the Wroxton itself. The Wroxton's a 6-story apartment block with 32 apartments. It was designed by Dudley Ward, completed in 1936. So it's an early building. What you find is that most of the Deco-style buildings were built, a few were built just before the Depression. Most of them were built after the Depression, and nothing much happened between about 1930 and 1935. And then there was an influx of buildings, particularly in this area of the Deco style. So it's one of the earliest of Sydney's buildings in the functional streamlined style. Dudley Ward was influenced by innovations in public housing in Germany and Holland, and he often designed furniture for his domestic and commercial commissions. And Wroxton stands out because of the blonde brickwork, curved open verandas, and they protrude like modern version of medieval battlements. And there are also Art Deco motifs like chevron patterns, fretwork in the vertical banks of windows on either side of the balcony. So it's a very pretty building, and particularly because of its light colouring. Ward also designed the Gowrie Gate apartments in Macleay Street, which you can see on the left here of this picture, and which was built in 1938. So it's after the Wroxton. Bruce Dellett designed originally the Minerva complex, which is on the other corner. So on this picture here, the black and white, you can see the corner of Gowrie Gate in Orwell Street and the Minerva complex, which was built opposite and designed originally by Bruce Dellett, who designed the Anzac War Memorial. He became ill, and Crick and Firth were the architects who took over the exterior design, but Dudley Ward, who designed or was the architect for Gowrie Gate, actually finished the interiors for the Minerva Metro complex. Another couple of buildings which look a little like the Wroxton is Winston, which is not far away. It's about a couple of 100 metres away from the Wroxton in Elizabeth Bay. Montclair in Darlinghurst has a similar sort of style. And also, if you see Templeton in Point Piper, it also has a similar design to the Wroxton. The Wroxton's is one of the things about the area is it's unlikely anybody's ever going to be built out. It's not like other areas where you buy and suddenly Mirvac or Meriton is building another apartment block next door. These sort of buildings in our area will, I think, almost forever retain their aspect. So the views from Wroxton, from the front balconies, you can see east. You're looking across there at a bank of very beautiful terrace houses across to the rest of Potts Point and Elizabeth Bay, and to the east over the Rushcutters Bay area, including Rushcutters Bay itself. One of the nice features of the Wroxton is the entrance. It's quite imposing, quite theatre-like, with staggered curved brick elements angling to the entry doors. The outside lights are recent additions replicating the original style, and the signage is really very elegantly placed in the centre there. The foyer, where are we going? Backwards now. That's interesting. Hang on a sec. Okay, the foyer. Beautiful foyer with wood paneling and these wonderful horizontal accents. And it has one of the best and only terrazzo floors in the neighbourhood. Very rare to see terrazzo floors. You see a lot of them in the city, but not many of them in apartment blocks in the area. Now, the area is studded with beautiful parks. It's one of its really wonderful features. Rushcutters Bay and its park is a few metres away, just below Wroxton. The tranquil Bear Park is about a 5-minute walk, and a tiny little treasure, Macalone Reserve, just a little further away. Both Bear Park and Rushcutters Bay have restaurants, which is lovely, and they're ideal for walking your dogs and doing exercise. This is our little COVID puppy, a bit older than that now. This is Roxy. She's a Havanese, and she hasn't graced us with her presence at the moment. If you're actually interested in Sydney's Art Deco treasures, I'd recommend my book, Sydney Art Deco, came out in 2019 and then was reprinted again in 2020. The Wroxton is in that. And if you want to get a flavour of the area, this walking booklet that has just been released this month is really ideal for getting an in-depth sense of the community. They're available from bookshops, online resellers, and you can get them through my website, sydneyartdeco.com. Both these books are important records of the style, and I was trying really hard to produce something that had academic and long-term record value, but would also be accessible to the broad community. So it wasn't a book that was so dense with text that you couldn't read it, or that had just so many lists that nobody wanted to bother. So by making it affordable and accessible to the broad community, I hope this might enhance the recognition and appreciation of the style, ultimately engendering broader support in the maintenance and preservation of what I think is this fascinating segment of Sydney's recent history. If you look at the map in the walking booklet, you will see it takes about 2 to 3 hours to walk around the area. There are 100 buildings worth seeing, and they're all included and referenced and photographed in the book. And you can see here, the Wroxton is number 16 in the Deco group, which is in purple, whereas the purple circles, whereas the modernist buildings are blue squares. And I thought at the time, I was originally only going to do this about Art Deco, but I realized that I'd never do a book on modernist buildings. I didn't actually like them all that much. But I thought if I was going to do it, a book on this, you have to walk past the modernist buildings when you're looking at the Art Deco buildings. So I thought I'd include them in, and I've become quite, I get Harry Seidler. I think, we've got 5 buildings in the area by Harry Seidler, and that's an extraordinary grouping of important buildings from the 60s. And let me say that although they talk about this area being protected, almost none of these buildings are listed and heritage listed properly. I mean, the Minerva Theatre, the Metro Theatre, was only listed in December last year. And that is the best example of functionalist, streamlined architecture in the theatre in Australia. And yet nobody's thought to bother listing these things. So while that's another problem that we need to ensure that people realise how important this area is in toto, and the buildings as individual buildings. And I imagine that the Wroxton, I don't know for sure, I didn't check it, but I would imagine it's probably locally listed by council, but not heritage listed. And while you might worry that heritage listing would impose certain restraints on a building, to be frank, I think it's really getting more and more important with these buildings now becoming 100 years old, that they are properly listed and protected. I put, sorry, this keeps going backwards, which is really annoying. So I put a couple of pages on the Wroxton in the book, so it features quite prominently. For those who might be interested in Sydney's architecture and its cultural and industrial relics of the time, anybody got any idea where these 2 pictures come from? Not easy. The top one is the lift doors in the MLC building in Martin Place. And the bottom one is the floor of the State Theatre in Market Street. So these are Art Deco motifs that are built into our architecture that you could walk on or walk past and not even realise. And just to give you a hint of how Art Deco influenced our lives, this is the AWA Radiolette radio made in the Asheville factory in 1934, and the little cigarette box that the salesman could give to their favourite sellers, the shops.
Pardon my ignorance, Peter. What is a cigarette box? Is it a lighter or?
No, you put your cigarettes in it.
Oh, it's literally holding cigarettes.
It's a cigarette box. Right. Yeah, the lid opens up and the cigarettes are in there. And this would have been sitting on your table. These radios were they were the first incidents of art meeting industry. It was the first time that the consumer could actually buy a product which actually was more than just its functional event. So a radio, yes, it had programs, it talked to people and so forth, but you bought a radio for its design as well and where it fitted into your home. So this was the first time that design, and these were industrial designers, particularly in America and England, who took an object that had no predecessor. This tabletop radio in 1930 had no predecessor. And so it didn't follow like the gramophone, which had legs and a box and was made out of wood. And people designed these radios in all sorts of forms, like they were like cars, they were like buildings, they were like teardrops, they could be of all sorts of shape. and colors, which would allow people to have beautiful objects. And of course, these were also designed at a time in the Depression when people had no money, and yet people wanted a radio. These were designed for the woman of the house, and they were designed to get it out of the lounge room so people could have radios in the kitchen, in the bedrooms, and all sorts of places. So this is a huge story of industrial design and consumerism through the style of Art Deco.
So can I just jump in here for 1 second? I'd just love to ask you a little bit more, going back to those maps that you flashed up earlier. You showed that there's a big Art Deco precinct in the city, and then of course in this 2011 postcode. How is it that this postcode became so prolific with that style of architecture? I mean, why did they choose this area to continue building Art Deco?
I think because it was close to the city. A lot of the old mansions, people ran out of money. There were lots of ups and downs. What's his name? Maclay built Elizabeth Bay House in, I think he moved in 1934 or 1936. He was broke by 1834, 1836. He was broke by 1840. And so there were the land that he had, this whole area that he had, was then opened up, and a lot of mansions were built in the area. And then by the turn of the century, there were ups and downs. And so they started to look at building apartment blocks. And what happened after the First World War was there was a service crisis. A lot of, this is Downton Abbey sort of stuff. A lot of people after the First World War did not want to be domestics anymore. And so they had to have somewhere to live. And these apartment blocks were places for people after the war who came back and said, I don't want to be a domestic anymore. I want to live, I want to work in the city, I want to do things. So they built these apartment blocks, which catered for a lot of single people who came back from the war who didn't have family anymore. Husbands died, brothers and sisters died. So there was many reasons why people rented in these apartment blocks near to the city. The other side of that coin was that people living in the big houses in Wahroonga and places like that couldn't get servants anymore because people didn't want to live in the houses. So they started building these large apartment blocks with company title like Maclay Regis, Bertley Towers and Cahors for wealthy people who wanted to live in apartments. So these apartments had lifts, whereas the rented apartments tended to be 3 stories and walk up. The big apartment blocks had larger apartments. They had shops at the bottom, and you could ring up from your apartment the shop at the bottom and get your food or your flowers or the cobbler or whatever. And so people were being encouraged to come and live in these larger apartment blocks from the suburbs. So this all came together to in what we see today as the apartment blocks in this area.
Peter, it's been so interesting listening to you chat today. I'd love to just throw it open now to some of our viewers to ask some questions. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask Peter?
I think, can I just ask, just on the walks? So are you, because a friend of mine just did one of the walks around, and maybe did you allow guests into your house or something?
I did.
I think, yeah. Because I think she was talking about the radios as well, and just and I know she bought the book.
Yeah, well,
so,
Claudia Chan does these walks for the Renaissance people, Claudia and I have been friends for a long time. So she asked me, could they come and visit my house and have a look at our collections? So
a friend of mine that's moved here did the walk, and I thought I must do the walk when we're allowed to do that again.
Yep. All right. Yeah. Well, I've agreed. I think they're doing another one in November, so they say.
Fingers crossed.
Okay. Yes.
Peter, if you will keep me in the loop as to when that's happening, and then I can keep our group informed.
Sure.
Anybody else got a question for Peter on any of the subjects that we've raised this afternoon? If there's no questions, Peter, I might just ask you something that you and I touched on when we were chatting offline earlier, and you said that a lot of this Art Deco architecture and buildings had been built for people to rent. They weren't built for people to buy.
Yeah, well, it follows on from that company title thing that if you couldn't buy through company title, you just had to rent. And so almost all the buildings other than the ones that are now still company title were owned by a family. And probably a good example is 4 Macleay Street, which is next to where I live. And that was owned until the late 1980s by one family. And then they started it off and kept about 6 apartments for themselves. And that became a strata apartment block. But up till that time, it was rented. And that was fairly typical of most of the smaller apartment blocks were individually owned by a family who that was their income. They built the apartment block as a rental income opportunity.
Peter, when we look at the Wroxton, we have the Roslyn Gardens facing side, which has the balconies. And then we have the other side of the building, which apartment 29 looks onto, which has those amazing views right across Rushcutters Bay through to the boats on the harbour. Why wouldn't they have put balconies on that side?
Honestly, I don't know, but let me say that one of the odd things about Sydney's architecture was that the harbour was not important until recently. And in the 1930s, I mean, I've got my dental practice is in BMA House, which is one of the first skyscrapers, Art Deco skyscrapers in Sydney. And it has beautiful views over the domain, over the Botanical Gardens, Government House, down to the water. And the windows are tiny little windows that you have to stand up on tippy toes to look out of.
Which seems absurd to us now, doesn't it?
It seems absurd. And because they were 15-foot ceilings, I raised the floor by about a metre. And so now when you stand there, you look out the windows, but it was never designed that way. And so you just have to get into this mental thing that the harbour was not important in those days. And I think also that there was a sort of staidness about design. I mean, Australia was very staunchly British. Things were done a certain way. And surprisingly, yeah, that's BMA House, yeah. 1930, both the Grace Building and BMA House were opened exactly the same month. And they're the first 2 Art Deco skyscrapers. So I can only say that looking at these buildings, you sort of have a sense that there was a template that we don't have today, and the priorities were different. And so there was a back and a front to a building, and the front got the best treatment and the back didn't. There are some buildings, however, which are different. If you look, and I'm trying to think what its name is, in Onslow Avenue, there's an apartment block which from the front looks like a Gothic sort of building, and from the back looks like an Art Deco functionalist building, but the views are at the back and the verandas are at the back. So somebody was clever there and put the verandas at the back, nothing at the front, which just faces up towards Macleay Street. But it does not surprise me that there are no verandas at the back, and it's just part of this. I don't know, you just have to sort of say to yourself, they didn't have the same mentality in the way that they built things as they would today. I mean, everybody today would assume that the apartment block would have its best views out over the water. And it's interesting that in Billiard Avenue, where I live, there are a number of apartment blocks which look very average facing the street, but their main feature and their verandas face the water. So at that time, some other people recognised how important that water view was, but there are many that didn't.
Elizabeth, did you have a question at all for Peter?
I did. Peter, you've spoken fantastically, aesthetically about this area, and I've lived here off and on since I was 16. But I've had two sons who are architects who've said the very, very best buildings are the ones that were built in the decade you're talking about. And Mum, don't buy something modern. And I'm really interested in your view of, well, I don't know if you're an architect. I don't know if you know this, but the engineering, the consistency of those buildings, the solidity of those buildings over time.
I agree. I mean, I had a Federation house in Killara, which was beautifully built. And I have a sense that there was a period, and if you look at the modernist buildings of the 60s, you have to say to yourself, and later, you have to say to yourself, there's concrete cancer, there's cheapness, there's all sorts of things that were left out in the rush to develop at the cheapest possible price. I think there was a pride in architecture and building that has sort of disappeared a bit over the years. So I think on the one hand, when you buy an Art Deco apartment, you get the best of infrastructure. What the only downside is that you've got to live with the fact that some of the services will need replacement over time. Pipes and things like that don't last forever. And for argument's sake, in BMA House, we have a constant issue with the copper pipes that were put in there in the 1930s and things that are requiring replacement. But if a building has been well maintained, I think the Art Deco buildings are beautifully built, you know, double brick. There was a real pride in the brickwork. I mean, if you look at Emil Soderson's work, you look at Dudley Ward's, all of those, they had such pride in the way they presented their brickwork. And I think that's reflected right through the building. You know, you get to Harry Seidler's stuff and you sort of think, oh God, you know, some of this is so tacky. And yet, but he was providing accommodation once strata came available for people to live near the water, in proximity to shops and things like that. But there's no doubt that the building structure suffered. So I agree. I think that these buildings of the 20s, 30s and 40s, you look at King's Clear in Greenock, 1912. I mean, it's beautiful. You look at the Astor Apartments in Macquarie Street, they're all beautifully built. And so I would think if you buy into a well-maintained Art Deco building, the downside is minor, the upside is great.
Any more questions for Peter before we sign off this afternoon? All right. Well, on that note, Peter, I might just send my very heartfelt thanks to you for making the time on this gorgeous Sunday afternoon. I mean, I'm sure we probably missed a few people from joining in because they're out in the park getting those last few rays of light. So very kind of you, Peter, given today and being a Sunday afternoon as well. Thank you. I know there's been a lot of interest in the Wroxton. Yeah, there you go.
Well,
you've already got someone buying your book.
That's fine. I like to talk about Art Deco anyway, so it's good. Thank you.
Thank you. And, thanks very much. Thanks for organising.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Pleasure. See ya. Bye.
Great to see you all. Thanks again. Bye, Peter.
Bye.